security is absolutely a team sport. You have to make sure that endpoint, network, and identity are coming together in a correlatable way for you to really respond effectively to the number of threats that you're facing every day.
You're listening to KBcast, the cybersecurity podcast for all executives. Cutting through the jargon and hype to understand the landscape where risk and technology meet. Now, here's your host, Carissa Breen.
Joining me today is Darren Reid, Senior Director, Security Business Unit, APJ from VMware. And today we're discussing XDR. So Darren, thanks for joining. It's wonderful to have you here on the show today.
Carissa, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to get straight into it, Darren. XDR. Now, tell me exactly what does this mean for those who are unfamiliar, because there's like EMDR, and there's all sorts of different acronyms now floating about. So I think people's version of what XDR means to them is maybe slightly skewed. So I'm keen to hand it over to you to tell us a little bit more about what it means.
Great, thank you. And you're right. I think as an industry, we certainly love acronyms, don't we? So XDR, from a VMware perspective, is really an extension to the endpoint detection and response technology that Carbon Black really defined the market for about 3 years ago. XDR, as far as we're concerned, takes your endpoint detection and response capabilities and adds in telemetry from your network and telemetry from your identity and access management. And what it does is it brings all three of those things together to correlate potential threats or potential attacks and put them in a single console. We do see in the industry people add a whole bunch of things into the XDR story. We're quite deliberate in how we see this, and we believe that keeping it focused on endpoint and the various elements that hang off the endpoint, such as the network and identity, is the right way to consider XDR as we go forward.
So when you say, Darren, people are adding in other things, what are the other things that people are sort of adding in?
I have seen a slide literally put together 25 different security technologies and called all of those together XDR. I think that's a statement of just how fragmented the security industry is. We see studies that say that the average mid-tier enterprise sort of organization has about 47 security tools in deployment or in activity at the moment. And many companies report that they've deployed 5 or more security tools in the last 6 months. And I think that's exactly the challenge. The industry keeps adding more and more tooling, but really isn't solving some of the fundamental problems, which is, that we don't have enough people, that the volume of data that we're producing is just so enormous and just so overwhelming that organizations have no ability to really correlate or understand that there's necessarily a threat or an attack going on. And I also think that the volume of data that we're providing to our poor SOC teams, on the basis that if the more data equals more protection, is really quite a fallacy. So the way we see it is by bringing these three key areas of security together: endpoint protection and detection and response, network protection, detection and response, and then identity detection or identity tracking to watch out for, compromised credentials or credentials that are perhaps being used in a nefarious way. Bringing those three things together, pre-correlating them before we give them to the SOC, and also then aligning the activity up against something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework or other tool sets like that. We're presenting the SOC teams with not only legitimate intelligence that says we're seeing a potential threat, we've tested it against a MITRE ATT&CK framework or something similar, and we believe it's a genuine threat. And here are the steps that we recommend you take to, respond to that threat in an effective way. I think that helps take away what we call SOC burnout, or, where the defenders and the analysts in your SOC team are just so overwhelmed with data that they can't quite recognize problems as they may be occurring.
Yeah, okay, that definitely makes sense. So the main ones that people are probably familiar with are XDR, EDR, and MDR, I think. So I think that's where some of the confusion probably sits for people, because they are, in terms of acronym letters, are very close to one another. Would you say that that's the case, that people are not quite sure, like, the difference between XDR, EDR, MDR? There's a lot of things going on there.
That's absolutely true, Carissa. And, as we say, the industry loves an acronym, right? But what I think happens is certain vendors come from certain heritages. If you are a network security vendor and you're wanting to get into sort of endpoint security, then you will talk about NDR and EDR because that's your natural heritage. If you're an endpoint vendor and you're wanting to get into network security, then you'll start talking about EDR and then NDR. If you then look at VMware, for instance, we actually come from both places. So Carbon Black as a brand and as a company was an endpoint solution provider, and that's where it was founded. VMware has spent its whole time in virtualization, looking at network virtualization, operating system virtualization, and so on. So we have a really long heritage in networking and a really long heritage in endpoint. And bringing those two technologies together makes perfect sense to us. It's something that we understand really well. And that's why we're defining XDR in the way that we are. Rather than trying to say to a customer, you need to go and buy more technology, we're actually saying, take the technologies you already have and use them in a far more effective way.
Yeah, okay, that totally makes sense what you're saying, because VMware's come from both of those sides of the coin. So maybe just at a high level, Darren, the first thing that comes to your mind in terms of value that XDR plays in an organization. Now, I asked this because, before doing this interview, I sort of asked people in my network that are close to me to be like, hey, what's your interpretation of this? And I think the main thing from what I ascertained was, what is the immediate value when it comes to XDR?
I think there's three things. Firstly, it's about speed to detection. Secondly, then it's about correlating your response and understanding just how pervasive this attack or this particular issue, malware issue may be. And then thirdly, it's about a coordinated action or set of actions from your teams in terms of how they go and remediate or respond. So let's take them in order. So the first thing is about how you detect it. So today, in a lot of larger companies, you'll have a network security team who are separate from your endpoint security team, who are separate from your identity security team. Each of those teams will potentially see a problem, but they don't have the full information or the full correlation of what's actually going on. So your endpoint team might see a system go out to the web and download a payload of malware. They'll respond to that by shutting that particular activity down. But if that activity is happening on 100 endpoints or 1,000 endpoints, they may not necessarily know that yet. Equally, you might have an application that's sitting on your cloud environment that suddenly, for some unknown reason, starts talking to another application on your network. Now, your network team might say, those two IP addresses don't normally talk to one another, or we don't normally use that particular port to transfer information. And then from an identity perspective, you might say, Carissa's forgotten her password 4 times. We'll just help her reset that. But you might not recognize that's actually a brute force attack on your particular identity credential. If all of those three things are happening together and the three teams aren't talking to one another, which is very common because they're all very busy, you won't necessarily understand that your environment or your organization is under sustained attack. You might simply think that it's a couple of anomalies in 2 or 3 different places. What XDR gives you is a single console to see all of that information correlated together, so you can see that it's not just an endpoint attack, it's not just an identity attack. We have a pervasive problem in our environment. We have malware, we have potentially threat actors moving, island hopping across different networks to get to our key data, or perhaps using, compromised credentials, which we've obviously seen in some of the recent breaches that have been reported in Australia. So putting all three of those things together means you can understand just how big the problem is. So then what happens is these teams, because they're now using a single console, they get to see all of the same sets of information. They may interpret it slightly differently, or they may take different actions, but at least in this scenario, it's coordinated and we're all running off the same play sheet. So we know we've got an endpoint problem, a network problem, and potentially an identity problem that we all need to go together as a team to resolve. And several things happen in that scenario. Firstly, our teams are far more effective because they're coordinated. Secondly, everybody knows what each other is doing, and so they can play as part of a team in a fashion that's quite dynamic. So we're not following a playbook, and when I finish, you pick up, and then when you finish, someone else picks up. We're actually moving in a dynamic fashion because our attackers are doing exactly the same thing. And so then the third thing is, because we're coordinated, because we can see the threat, because we can see all of the things that are going on around this particular threat, we can take a very coordinated response and start, perhaps micro-segmenting the network, holding off the endpoints that are compromised from attaching to any other part of our environment, prevent them from accessing cloud-based applications. We could maybe isolate that particular identity and prevent it from being allowed access until we've remediated the attack problem or the compromise problem. And that's really the key promise for XDR. Instead of having 3 teams or 3 consoles or 54 tools or whatever it is, you're all dealing off the same information that is already put together in a way that you can respond and understand just how significant the blast radius may be from a particular attack that's occurring in your environment.
Gotcha. Okay. Wow. Okay. Thank you so much for that clarification. So, okay, there's a couple of things in my mind as you're speaking. They may appear sort of dumb because it's not my area of maybe expertise, like historically speaking, but I know that this is important based on, as I said, some of the research I had conducted originally. So if a company has like XDR, for example, so then what's the need then for EDR or like MDR? Does XDR override EDR and MDR, or do they become obsolete, or do you sort of need all of them? Like in a perfect world, if you want to position it like that, I understand budgets and those types of things, it depends. But from your point of view, how does that look?
Definitely not a dumb question. I think a lot of customers are probably grappling with exactly the same thing. The way we would say it is it's a maturity curve. So if you have a SOC or you have operators in your environment that specialize in security, XDR is the extension to the tools you already have, and you would probably replace your EDR, NDR tools with an XDR agent. And the way that we're deploying XDR at VMware and Carbon Black is it's a single agent providing both network telemetry, endpoint telemetry, and identity telemetry to the console. So you don't need 3 agents, you simply need 1. So for a larger scale environment where you've scaled out your SOC and your detection and response teams, you would replace probably 3 or 4 agents, and you'd also replace all of those hard network taps that you have floating around the network. One of the problems with the network tap these days, of course, is that a lot of our network's done in the cloud, and a lot of the activity happens in containers, or a lot of the activity happens in virtualized environments. So it never actually hits the hard network. So your taps are only seeing potentially less than 50% of what's actually going on in your environment. So we see a point where the hard network tap will eventually disappear. We certainly see XDR as a legitimate replacement for those because it can track network activity at the endpoint, which is where the primary network activity is either initiated or indeed occurs. And an endpoint in our circumstances is a physical hard device like a laptop, or a container, a Kubernetes container, or a VMware virtualized environment, or indeed a workload sitting in a cloud. We don't really define endpoint as having to be a hard device. And so I think what we'll start to see is for organizations who are that mature, big SOC, full team built, they will replace their EDR, NDR, hard network taps and other things with an XDR solution. I think if you're not that mature or don't have a size and scale to own your own SOC, you will probably be using some kind of managed services provider. The services provider will want the same benefits that an internal SOC team would want. Better visibility, easier and faster response and detection. And XDR provides them that same benefit. And so we expect to see a lot of managed services providers moving their customers from a default sort of endpoint protection product, a separate, some sort of network detection product, and they'll correlate those two things together in an XDR solution and deploy that over time. And then for smaller customers, again, who perhaps really don't have budgets for large-scale security deployments, but are, often the most at risk. They're the ones that are most penalized if a malware event occurs and locks up their corporate environment and so on. We think that they will mature from a more traditional antivirus type solution set to an endpoint protection product. And so as they mature and as their organizations develop and grow and the threats become perhaps better understood, we see that they will move up the maturity level from endpoint protection to an EDR type solution to eventually move to XDR if indeed their business grows that significantly. So XDR is really a solution set for service providers, whether they're servicing multiple organizations, or the more mature organizations who have a well-developed SIEM and SOC type environment, or those who are looking to get out of a SIEM because they're finding the volume of data that they have is just insurmountable. And so they're collecting data almost for the sake of that rather than making it really valuable. So there's a couple of different scenarios in there, Carissa.
Yeah, right. Okay, that makes so much more sense now. And that's what I was curious about. I just wasn't sure. So just so I have that right, Darren, in terms of, you mentioned before, if you're a service provider or you're more of a mature organization, and I mean, these are not the right terms, but sort of, replace EDR. So I think that would be sort of the reason why that would be more apparent versus, like you mentioned before, for more, smaller organizations or immature organizations probably don't feel the need then for that necessarily.
I think it's less about a need and more about ability to use. So if you don't have a dedicated security team, then, what you probably got is a couple of IT people who run around fixing the printer, fixing the network, updating Windows and so on, and do security as a part-time job. Those people probably aren't looking at the telemetry that's coming out of your environment. They're probably not spending time correlating events in a scene. So XDR is not going to really add anything to them because they're already not looking at the telemetry that's coming anyway. But for organizations who do have teams that are watching telemetry, that are trying to correlate threats, that are trying to bring together multiple endpoint or network data and try and understand what's going on, they are already overwhelmed. They already have way too much data, way more data than they've ever thought of before, and it's only growing. And then we add the pressure of the board or management or the customer or whoever it might be coming in and saying, but are we protected? Are we okay? And the reality is, I think for these SOC teams, they don't know. They would say, we think so, or we hope so. But I think the reality is there's just so much data for them, they can't possibly get to it all. So there could be buried in that data a threat that they haven't seen, an attack that they didn't realize was going on. And I think there was a study, I think IBM did it last year, that said the average attacker exists inside an environment for like 221 days or something. I think the reality of that is that the attackers are in an environment and executing a payload of some description in less than 45 days now. It's much more about getting in, getting a payment and getting out than it is just sitting there waiting to see what the environment's all about. So I think if you already have a team that's looking at telemetry, if you already have a response team in your business, XDR is a massive boon for them because it does the correlation first. It then presents it against a framework that they understand to help them prioritize the potential threat, and it makes recommendations as to how they should respond. That's a very, very powerful set of insights that probably their SIEM isn't giving them today. But if you're not looking at the telemetry, XDR doesn't give you any additional value.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. That's where I was trying to sort of get to with my line of questioning. And I think that would become apparent, like when you're speaking to a company, an organization, to find that out, to say, well, if you're not looking at it anyway, there's probably no need for it then.
Yeah. What we would say there is if you have an antivirus on your endpoints, that is only a fraction of what you need. You would need to go to some kind of anti-malware response tool, which we call endpoint protection, for want of a better term. And they come in a variety of flavors from VMware and Carbon Black, and there's other vendors out there that do similar things. But, the days of a simple antivirus tool, because what it used to do was look for particular file signatures or file hashes, that's long gone. The malware actors don't use the same files anymore. They don't use the same hashes anymore. But what we do is in the next gen antivirus, or NGAV, if you like, is basically looking at behaviors. So it's saying things like a system executing on your laptop that's going to a website and it's downloading a file. That website we know to be bad or we're concerned about. That file that's coming down, we recognize it as a malware payload or we're concerned about. And we're following this process through until we have enough information to say this is definitely malicious. So we may even allow an initial execution of the payload, but before it can actually do anything damaging, we can stop it. If it says, for example, one of the Windows system files is launching a third-party executable, that might be to do a Windows update. We know they're okay, we'd allow that to happen. But it might be it's launching a third-party tool that's going to encrypt your hard drive. Before it gets to do that, it makes a call to beneath the operating system that we know is potentially a problem. We'll stop that and hold it and just literally retain it in place until a human being can come along and look and go, oh, actually, no, that's one of our applications. We know how that works. That's okay. Or actually that is a malware attack, we're going to hold that off to one side. And we effectively corral not just that particular activity, but we also corral that endpoint from doing anything else until someone has come along and said it's legitimate or it's malicious. And so even if you're like a smaller company that hasn't got a full investment in SOC teams and response teams and so on, a next generation antivirus tool or an endpoint protection tool is absolutely a requirement these days. And if you're in critical infrastructure or you're under, you're working for another organization or partnering with an organization that's in critical infrastructure, that's considered now the minimum under the ASD Essential 8 standards and things like that. So I think for most organizations, they will have to move off the traditional antivirus to an endpoint protection tool of some description. And then as they get more mature, they'll come up to things like XDR.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Okay. So you mentioned before when I asked you, like, what at a high level, what is the value around XDR? And one of the things that you mentioned was speed to detection. So how does that work? Like, can you give me an example on how that's faster?
Sure. So you can't stop what you can't see would be the first thing I would say. And so if all you have is endpoint telemetry data and you don't have network data, then you have no idea whether people are moving through your network, island hopping, passing between applications, using one application to sort of cloak their activity to heading to another one. You can't see any of that. Then all of your cloud data is completely invisible, or all of the data that happens in your virtual machines is completely invisible. So the first thing is about having greater visibility. You've got to be able to see these attacks or these activities happening, so you then know whether they're malicious. You can start making an assessment whether they're malicious or not. So visibility is the first thing. When you then have visibility and you have multiple data sources coming together in a single database, like a SIEM style activity, it's up to you to figure out, is that IP address belong to this endpoint? Does that MAC address belong to which endpoint does that? You have to go and manually pull all of that information together. That is a very onerous task. And it's highly possible that you'll miss something because you're talking about literally thousands and thousands of lines of data per minute, per hour, depending on how busy your environment is. If you multiply that then across thousands of endpoints and you multiply that across thousands of networks, you're in data that, really a human being could never possibly correlate themselves. It's beyond the capability of human endeavor. And so not only are you not seeing it necessarily because it's lost in all of this data, but you're unable to prioritize it too. And so, if you see a person's identity that they've had to change their password or they've got their password wrong 3 or 4 times, that might be perfectly normal. It might be an attack. It might be a whole bunch of different things. You just don't know. And so by having the support of a tool set, and our XDR uses all of the network telemetry, all of the endpoint telemetry that we get back into our cloud sensors, we pass it through a very large scale machine learning AI based environment to try and start picking out correlatable events, to try and pick out potential threats. We also add a whole bunch of human intelligence to that as well. And you're getting the benefit of all of that activity out of our enormous data lake, which then feeds back into your console. So not only do you not have to try and figure out what you've missed, what you haven't seen, is the data important, is it not? Because our XDR solution is doing all of that work for you. All you then need to do is look at the threat that we've presented to you, decide how impactful that is in terms of your environment. Now, if you had malware on the CEO's laptop and that was all it went to, yes, that's a pain. But if you had someone exfiltrating your entire customer database, that is a significant problem. So you're making those assessments yourself, and then you're choosing to respond. And you might automate a response. You might do a manual response. You might micro-seg your network and cut somebody off in a particular area so it doesn't extend into the rest of your network. There's a whole raft of different responses you might choose to take. But the first thing is you've got to see it. The second thing is you've got to be able to correlate it or have something correlated for you. And then the third thing is you've got to respond. And so if we can make those first 2 pieces faster, all the data's there, we've correlated it for you so you don't need to worry about trying to figure it all out. Then all you're really concerned about is making sure your response is effective. And by the way, we're giving you some hints as to how you might do that. That's a far more effective way of responding to an attack than trying to do it all yourself.
Okay, so there's a couple of things in there that you mentioned that I want to sort of get into. Now, when it comes to capturing all of the telemetry, do you do like an initial like tooling for like discovery to make sure you have everything to sort of pull it all together initially? Is that what you're saying?
So when you deploy XDR on your endpoint, it will start doing a discovery over your network environment.
Gotcha.
Typically, what it does is we recommend people run it for about a month. So it makes sure it picks up all the various networks because you and I both know people travel, they plug into hotels, they plug into different offices, or maybe they're in Wi-Fi at home or they're in a coffee shop. So the network is constantly changing. And so we recommend that you run it for about a month, and it generally has picked up the majority of your network environment. And then if it finds something that's new because you've added a new cloud or you've added a new data center or you've moved office locations or you've changed your IP addresses or whatever it might be, it'll flag that for you, and you can then make some decisions around, no, that's okay, that entire subnet is fine to be released, or no, actually that's not one of our IP addresses, so it's actually a potential attack or potential threat. You start basically tuning the environment to enable it to be more effective.
Yeah, great. That was going to be my next question, to say after that month, then what happens? But you've already answered that. So you said before, you got to be able to see it, correlate, and then respond. So on the correlation side of things, now I historically used to be a reporting analyst in a security team, so I understand about correlating the data. How would you effectively do that? Because, I mean, look, a lot of these like tools or things that I've seen in my career have been, there's so much stuff going on, right? So yes, it kind of makes sense that it's all there. But from my understanding of being a reporting analyst, like you can report for days on end. If you're not deriving insights from those reports, it's kind of worthless, or else people are sifting through all this information, trawling through different things. And then at the end of it, it's like, oh, I couldn't be bothered. There's too much stuff going on. So people don't actually even look at it in reality. So then what would be your sort of response to making sure the stuff that you are correlating makes sense to people that they can actually derive insights from?
I think that's a great point, Carissa. And we do see a lot of companies who either are reporting everything just in case or are reporting nothing for the same reason, because they just can't get their heads around all the data that they're receiving. So part of the reason that we use things like MITRE and compare our attack vectors that we're seeing against MITRE is to determine whether indeed it's an attack. And if it is, what sort of attack is it likely to be? What sort of, attack group is it, or what sort of methods are they using, to try and give the console operator or the reporter, as you say, the right sort of information, but also to help them prioritize. One of the things we really recommend people do is start with understanding what's their most critical data. What's the data or the information asset they can least afford to lose? And based on what that is, whether it's a database or an application or whatever it might be, go and compare that to the known attack vectors that apply to that particular environment. So if you're running SQL Server, for example, there's a set of attack vectors that are known to attack SQL Server, and you should go and be careful and make sure that you understand how likely or how possible those are in your environment, and then take steps to protect that particular application or that particular data set as your first priority. Because in reality, an attacker is not really after your footy tipping lap. They're after data that they can monetize, or things that they can then monetize through malware to, that's going to prevent your business from running, that you're going to pay the money and pay the ransom because you need your business back up and running. Footy tipping ladder, probably not the biggest problem you've got. And so from there, once you have that, then you start teaching your XDR console, what are your primary assets? You start tuning around those assets particularly so that the tool set knows if it starts to see a threat or an attack against those assets, it calls it out as a very high priority alert. And the same rules apply when you're reporting. You can go back to your board, back to your CISO or your CIO or your CEO or whoever it might be, your customers, and say, our most critical assets are our most highly protected assets. And here's the red team, blue team that we ran against them. We're confident that we are in a position to protect and defend where necessary and respond if absolutely necessary to an attack against these assets. And we prove that through a series of well-rehearsed response activities, capture the flag activities, red team, blue team events, and so on. But you have to start with the information. What's the asset you're trying to protect? What are you trying to protect it from? And then you apply tooling, and then you apply your response.
So hypothetically, Darren, if someone just didn't leverage XDR, what would happen? Now, I asked this question because, look, you definitely explained it earlier in terms of, maturation of the organization, and specifically if they were a service provider, it makes a little bit more sense versus companies who aren't as mature, that may be sort of leveraging more MDR or EDR solutions. So I'm just always curious because I was mindful that so many companies out there, I think I was in an interview the other day that an average company in Australia uses like 70 to 75 different tools, right? There's definitely much of overlap on that front. But then also there's probably tools just sitting there that aren't actually being utilized more effectively. I don't know, maybe someone's come into the organization, they've bought some tooling and then they've left and it just sort of sits there and it just gets shelved. No one knows about it as well. Or the vendor's not coming in to actually say, this is how you use the tool effectively, or we've added new features into it and people don't necessarily know how to utilize it effectively for their organization. So I'm always just sort of mindful and asking those questions then as well. So if someone was like, oh, well, we're not that mature, we don't really have the capability to, be leveraging XDR much to what you said earlier, what would sort of happen?
So you're absolutely right. There are immense numbers of tools in organizations. So very few organizations are ready to be systems integrators for a security tool set. So looking at platform-based type tooling where you can get, an XDR type solution, bringing together all of those 3 or 4 different telemetry points, that's a really smart way of solving for that problem. I think if you don't have XDR, I would certainly hope that you've got an endpoint protection tool set, that you're doing network monitoring, that you're encrypting your data, that you're, trying to correlate some of the telemetry you're getting out of your environment. But the reality is you're probably missing at least a third and probably more of all the information that's going on in your environment. Your people will be burnt out, almost for sure, or at least overwhelmed, if not quite at the point of burnout. You're likely to have a reasonable amount of churn in your security team. And if that's true, you'll find recruiting the next round of security people harder and harder because more and more companies are looking for them. The salaries are going up. There's less of them in the market because, frankly, they are burning out. They are, just totally overwhelmed by the volume of data that they're seeing. So we've got to get smarter in terms of the tools that we do deploy. I think less tools rather than more is actually the answer. I think being selective, as I said, about which assets you're choosing to protect with your highest value tools and your highest value people will become far more important. And I think that we'll see a consolidation of tooling where customers say, I'm not going to deploy any more security tools until I'm satisfied that the ones I have are either in use and properly configured and we're trained and we know how to use them and deploy them effectively, or older tools or less useful tools or tools that are no longer relevant to my organization are removed from the environment and causing less noise. And I think once organizations have made those decisions, they will come to a point where they say, there's a set of tools that we absolutely need. And there's a set of skills that we absolutely need in-house. And there'll be other skills that we're prepared to outsource or hand off to a partner or, partner on to have a combination of internal and external skills. And then the last thing they'll start to do is they'll become far more savvy in terms of their reporting. So that we're already seeing organizations like the Australian Institute of Company Directors coming out with, here's 10 questions that the board should be asking about cybersecurity. I think that's a great start. I think the next piece of the puzzle will be, and here's the 10 answers that the board needs to be listening for, because asking questions is one thing. Understanding the answers is far more important in my mind. So I do think that, whilst not every company in the world will ever deploy XDR, that's probably not realistic. I think we'll see more and more customers and companies moving to an XDR-based solution because it will enable their security teams, whether they be internal or external, to do more and see more and therefore prevent more and respond more effectively when they do get attacked.
So when you said before, Darren, teams are being burnt out as a consequence because they're doing things a lot more manually in terms of alert fatigue, a lot of stuff going on, not making sense of everything that's happening. They feel they're overwhelmed by all the data feeds that they've got to look at. Is that what you mean by that? And then I guess, if you were to leverage XDR, for example, that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting for internal teams. Is that correct?
Absolutely right. I mean, alert fatigue is a very serious problem that I don't think we really talk about often enough. But just as equally, you have the pressure. If you're a defender, you're a SOC team member, you're in operations for security, you probably get asked 10 times a month. Is everything okay? Are we secure? Should we be worried about anything? And the reality is you're spending your whole day, every day worrying about things. And in the event that your organization did get breached, and I hope it doesn't happen, but invariably it will at some point, you're the ones that are to blame because you didn't see that, you didn't catch that attacker, you didn't prevent that attack, you didn't, whatever it was that the world and the organization's expecting you to have done. And so I think we're already seeing, and I think we'll see more of, people leaving this part of the industry because there's just so much data flowing in. There's so much pressure coming from the organization to you as a defender. I sort of liken it to, air traffic control. When everything's going fine and the weather's clear and all the planes are lining up nicely and there's no delays, et cetera, it's actually it's a solid job and it's important and you need to be intelligent to do it, but you're not under as much pressure. But when there's an emergency in the air, the weather's gone terribly badly, we've got delays on the ground and you're trying to land 55 aircraft, it becomes really stressful really quickly. And I think we're seeing that kind of escalation in security. I think the SOC teams, as you say, are seeing alert fatigue a lot because because often we have these tools dialed up so high that everything's an alert and therefore nothing is. Or we turn them down so low because we're so sick of the alert that we miss a really important alert and then the organization's in all sorts of trouble. So I do think having smarter tooling, having tools that are doing the correlation in a really effective way, but also correlation against known attack vectors, correlation against known useful frameworks that are the product of literally millions and millions of hours of research. There's no way any one SOC analyst or any one cybersecurity operations person could possibly put that much time in to be effective on their own. And I think the tools have to support them better.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. You become very desensitized then. And you're like, oh, you missed like the main important thing we're supposed to look at. And then you're like, oh, they're to blame for it. So I totally understand what you're saying. Someone who has come from a more over that analyst, that data background, I get it. So, okay, I'd like to now sort of ask a different sort of question. And going back to my comment before, it was like 75 tools on average. I mean, it may even be more than that now. I don't know, but it's a lot. So I don't know if you remember, they don't have these anymore, but on cereal boxes, you used to have that little triangle, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs of, your sugars on how much you should have, which is obviously at the top end, like less so. If you were to look at XDR, where would you say would sit on the pyramid? Now, I know that's a hard question because, you're obviously talking about XDR and you work for VMware. I get that. But it's just more so to get a barometer on what you think, because you even mentioned before, Darren, it's probably best to have less tools and sort of overcomplicate things. I'm just genuinely curious about what your answer would be.
I think that's a really good question. So I remember seeing a Maslow's hierarchy that said top of the pyramid was love, the next one was shelter, and the third one was Wi-Fi. I thought that was pretty cool. What I would say is you need endpoint protection. You need something protecting your application, which may be endpoint or it may be an encryption or something along those sort of lines. And then you need something that correlates those things. And so XDR is kind of third or fourth if you walk down the list. It's certainly not the number one priority. I think that's endpoint protection because that's the most obvious and most common entry point into any organization is somebody's endpoint, whether it be email or, clicking on a link on a website or whatever. That's the most common point of compromise. Once an attacker is in your environment on an endpoint, then they use your network to pass through. So having some kind of network visibility, telemetry, et cetera, is important, but ultimately they're on their way somewhere. So they're heading to a data asset or an information asset or something like that that's going to cripple your organization and make you want to pay them to release it. And so in my mind, those three things are the first steps. Clear protection around your information assets, your most critical ones, the ones that are most monetizable. I'm not sure that's actually a verb, but you get the idea. Protection around your network to prevent people from island hopping and passing through your network and using that to get to those information assets. Protection on the endpoint to make sure that they can't even get into your environment in the first place. So endpoint first, network second, information assets third, and then XDR basically correlates all those together. So I'll put it fourth.
Well, at least you're honest about that because I don't know if many people would be honest about that. So I genuinely appreciate that. So Darren, in terms of any sort of closing comments or final thoughts, is there anything specific you'd like to leave our audience with today?
XDR is the evolution of the things we've done to this point. It's all about releasing your security team, whoever that is, whatever level of maturity they have. It's releasing them from the drudge and of trying to fight their way through this volume of data, this tsunami of data that's coming at them to find the things that are important. We're doing that work for them to make them more effective. And security is absolutely a team sport. You have to make sure that endpoint, network, and identity are coming together in a correlatable way for you to really respond effectively to the number of threats that you're facing every day. And in that way, I think your SOC teams will be able to legitimately say to a board or other C-level executives or your customers that you are indeed a protected environment.
Well, I think that's excellent. And I really enjoyed you going through things quite logically and methodically, because I do think my understanding of interviewing people across the range of cybersecurity, people are a bit overwhelmed and definitely confused about what all these terms and acronyms mean, why it makes sense. So I really appreciate that you've taken the time to go through that for people to understand. So thanks so much for your time, Darren, for coming on the show. And yeah, looking forward to interviewing again.
Carissa, it's been an absolute pleasure and I'd love to come back anytime. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope that you found today's episode useful and you took away a few key points. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get our latest episodes.
This podcast is brought to you by MercSec, the specialists in security, search, and recruitment solutions. Visit mercsec.com to connect today.
If you'd like to find out how KBI can help grow your cyber business, then please head over to kbi.digital.
This podcast was brought to you by KBI.media, the voice of cyber.